The story of the widow who married her slave woman begins not in the past, but with the violence of the present. In 1974, a hurricane tore through the South Carolina coast, flooding the basements of Beaufort's oldest institutions. From the silted water of the county courthouse, archivists recovered a single water-damaged merchant's ledger from the 1830s. Its pages contained a dark secret, a macabre mystery of finance that listed transfers of perishables and units to the town's most prominent families. These entries, however, corresponded to no known trade good. They were a record of a hidden crime, a buried truth about the children who disappeared from the parishes surrounding Beaufort, and the two women who would use this knowledge to bring an empire of sin to its knees. This is the story of Beaufort's forbidden marriage in 1842, a tale so disturbing that the town itself worked to erase it from history. It is a case that begins with a widow's grief and ends with a reckoning that would forever stain the legacy of the American South. It forces us to ask not only what happened to Eleanor Whitby and the woman she called her wife, but how many other children were found to be missing, their fates recorded only in the cold, cruel arithmetic of a killer's account book. How did one impossible act of love become a weapon of perfect silent justice? If you believe that some stories must be told, no matter how deeply they have been buried, then join our community of investigators by subscribing to Before the Story. Be sure to enable notifications so you never miss an uncovering. Like this video if you value these deep dives into the shadows of history. And let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The world of Eleanor Whitby was one of suffocating stillness, a world captured in the faded ink of her personal diary, recovered from a Charleston estate sale in 1958. Her first entry upon arriving in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1841 speaks not of hope but of surrender. She describes the humid air as a wet shroud and the moss-draped oaks as weeping sentinels guarding a town built on secrets. An Englishwoman far from home, she was the wife of Arthur Whitby, a merchant whose fortunes had dissolved like sugar in the oppressive summer rain, leaving them social spectres in a society that worshipped wealth. Their house, a decaying structure on the edge of town, was a testament to their ruin. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding in long curling strips, and the salt air corroded the ironwork of the gate until it bled rust onto the stone path. Inside, the silence was a living entity, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the distant, mournful cries of gulls over the marsh. Eleanor's writings from this period are a litany of isolation, detailing days spent staring out at a landscape that felt both beautiful and predatory, a place where nature itself seemed complicit in the town's unspoken cruelties. In this lonely world, only one other soul remained a constant: Nadia, a young Creole woman enslaved to the household. Eleanor's early descriptions of her are distant, the observations of a mistress noting a servant's efficiency. Yet even then, a different quality emerges in her words. She writes of Nadia's movements as being as silent as thought, and of her eyes holding a knowledge of tides and sorrows far older than this house. Nadia was more than a servant. She was the keeper of the home's dying pulse, a watchful presence in the encroaching gloom. Arthur Whitby, in his wife's diary, is a figure of profound absence. He is a man consumed by a failure he cannot articulate, spending his days locked in his study with ledgers that no longer held any value, or so it seemed. Eleanor describes his form at the dinner table as that of a man already hollowed out, his conversation reduced to monosyllabic responses, his gaze fixed on some middle distance she could not penetrate. The town of Beaufort, with its polite yet merciless judgment, had already condemned him, and he had accepted the verdict without appeal. The town itself is a character in these early pages, a place of sharp, unforgiving contrasts. The grandeur of the planters' mansions along the waterfront, with their manicured gardens and columned porches, stood in stark opposition to the Whitbys' decaying home. Eleanor writes of the Sunday services at St. Helena Episcopal Church, where the sermons on grace and redemption were delivered to a congregation whose fortunes were built on the brutal subjugation of human beings. She felt the hypocrisy like a physical weight, a moral sickness in the very air she breathed. Amid this social and spiritual decay, Eleanor's entries reveal a subtle shift. Her observations of Nadia become more detailed, more inquisitive. She notes Nadia's knowledge of medicinal herbs gathered from the marsh, her quiet humming of songs in a language Eleanor did not understand, her ability to predict the weather by the behavior of the fiddler crabs. A fragile, unspoken reliance was forming between the two women, a bond forged not in friendship, but in shared isolation within a house that was becoming a tomb. The final entries before the tragedy are heavy with foreboding. Eleanor describes Arthur's growing paranoia, his habit of starting at shadows, and his muttered, half-finished sentences about accounts that would not balance. She writes of sleepless nights, listening to the sound of her husband pacing his study, the scratch of his quill pen a frantic, desperate sound in the dead of night. She felt they were poised on the edge of a precipice, that the crushing weight of Beaufort's silence was about to break. On the evening of April 11, 1842, Eleanor wrote a single chilling line in her diary. Arthur told me tonight that some ink stains deeper than others, and that no amount of water can wash it away. Although she did not understand his meaning then, but she recorded a feeling of profound dread, a sense that his words were not a confession of financial failure, but of a sin far darker, a debt that could never be repaid with money. The stage was set for the first anomaly, the event that would shatter the silence forever. This small, isolated household, teetering on the brink of collapse, was about to become the epicenter of a moral earthquake. The dark secret of Beaufort was not hidden in the grand mansions of the elite, but in the frantic scribblings of a ruined merchant and the silent memory of the enslaved woman who watched him die. The truth was waiting in the ink, ready to bleed through the pages of history. The silence of the Whitby house was irrevocably broken on the morning of April 12, 1842. The official record of this rupture exists as a single dispassionate page in the Beaufort County Coroner's files. It documents the death of Arthur Whitby, concluding his life was ended by his own hand, the cause attributed to a state of profound melancholy brought on by severe financial distress. The document is clinical, its language designed to close a chapter, to categorize a tragedy, and file it away. It was the story Beaufort would tell itself, a neat and tidy explanation that cauterized the wound of a public shame. However, a second, far more intimate record of that morning survives, written in the frantic, spidery hand of Eleanor Whitby. Her diary entry from that night stands in stark opposition to the coroner's sterile prose. She describes the scene not as a quiet surrender to despair, but as a violent final statement. She writes of the scent of gunpowder hanging in the air of the study, a bitter incense in the humid morning, and the sight of her husband slumped over his desk, his life bleeding into the very papers that had consumed him. It was what she found clutched in his hand that became the first documented anomaly, the first piece of evidence that contradicted the town's convenient narrative. It was not a letter of apology, not a plea for forgiveness. It was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. When Eleanor pried it from his cooling fingers, she found 5 words written in his unmistakable script, a declaration that defied any notion of simple despair. The note read, Some debts are paid in blood. These were not the words of a broken man, but of a man settling a final terrible account. Eleanor's own account reveals her immediate rejection of the official story. The magistrate spoke of dishonor. She wrote, "But what I saw in Arthur's study was not the work of a coward. It was a judgment. He was not fleeing a debt. He was marking it paid." This conviction set her apart from the town's chorus of pitying whispers. While Beaufort saw a tragic but understandable end to a story of failure, Eleanor saw the beginning of a dark and horrifying mystery, a crime disguised as a suicide. Her diary also records the reaction of Nadia, a response that went beyond the expected grief of a servant for her master. Eleanor describes finding Nadia standing motionless in the doorway of the study, her gaze fixed not on Arthur's body, but on the open ledger on his desk. Eleanor wrote that Nadia's expression was not one of shock, but of grim, ancient recognition, as if she were not witnessing an end, but the fulfillment of a prophecy she had long dreaded. A silent understanding seemed to pass between the two women over the body of the dead man. The town of Beaufort moved quickly to absorb and neutralize the event. The funeral was a brief, sparsely attended affair. Neighbors offered condolences that felt more like pronouncements of judgment, their faces a mask of feigned sympathy that barely concealed their relief at the resolution of an uncomfortable social problem. The official narrative was reinforced with every wreath laid, with every prayer uttered for the soul of a man they had already condemned. For Beaufort, the case was closed. Eleanor, however, felt a profound and growing sense of being watched, of a collective effort to enforce the official version of events. She describes in her diary how Magistrate Thomas Sterling, a pillar of the community, visited her under the guise of offering assistance. Yet his questions seemed designed to confirm her husband's mental instability. He spoke of Arthur's erratic behavior and financial delusions, painting a picture that perfectly matched the coroner's report, but which felt profoundly false to the woman who had lived with the man. This pressure to accept a lie only hardened Eleanor's resolve. The cryptic note became her lodestone, the one solid piece of truth in a sea of polite deception. It was a key, she felt, to a lock she had not yet found. Her diary from this period is filled with a new and dangerous energy, the despair of a widow giving way to the cold focus of an investigator. She began to see her husband not as a failure, but as the first victim of a much larger crime. The entry for April 20th, 1842 marks the beginning of her quest. "They wish for me to be the grieving, helpless widow," she wrote. "They will find I am something else entirely. Tonight, I will enter his study not as his wife, but as his executor. I will search for the debt that cost him his life." She was no longer just mourning a death. She was investigating a murder, and the only clues were hidden in the paper tomb her husband had left behind. Eleanor Whitby's investigation began in the silent, oppressive atmosphere of her late husband's study, a room that still held the faint, metallic scent of his final act. Her diary from the late spring and summer of 1842 transforms into a meticulous, almost obsessive log of her search. She describes spending nights by candlelight, sifting through stacks of worthless bonds, unpaid invoices, and letters from creditors. For weeks, she found nothing but evidence of the financial ruin the town already knew, a paper trail leading to a dead end. The breakthrough came not from a document left in plain sight, but from one deliberately concealed. In a detailed entry from May, Eleanor recounts her discovery of a hidden compartment beneath a false bottom in Arthur's desk drawer. Inside, there was no hidden cache of money, no last will and testament. There was only a single heavy ledger bound in dark leather, its pages filled with her husband's precise, elegant script. It was the same ledger that would be salvaged from a flooded courthouse basement more than a century later. At first, the ledger's contents were incomprehensible. It was a cryptic record of transactions, with columns for dates, payments, and deliveries, but the items being traded were listed under bizarre headings: perishables, units, inland transfers. The names associated with these transactions were a roll call of Beaufort's most powerful families: Sterling, Davies, Alston. Eleanor's initial confusion is palpable in her writing. She wondered if it was a coded record of some desperate illicit trade Arthur had engaged in to save himself. It was Nadia who provided the key to deciphering the macabre puzzle. Eleanor's diary describes how she brought the ledger into the main house, leaving it open on a table. Nadia, while clearing the room, paused and stared at the page, her body going rigid. According to Eleanor, Nadia pointed to a small hand-drawn symbol next to Magistrate Sterling's name, a tiny, sharp crescent moon. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Nadia recognized the mark, Eleanor wrote, her handwriting showing a distinct tremor. She said it was the brand they used at the St. Helena parish, a mark placed on the children who were deemed troublesome, the ones who were later sold downriver to harsher masters, the ones who were never seen again. In that moment, the ledger ceased to be a financial document. It became a testament to an unspeakable horror, a directory of lost souls. With Nadia's guidance, the coded language of the ledger began to reveal its terrible secrets. Units referred to individual children. Perishables was the cruel designation for infants and toddlers, whose survival during transport was not guaranteed. Inland transfer was the euphemism for their sale into the deep interior, far from any chance of rescue or return. Each entry was a life, reduced to a line of ink, a transaction in a business built on stolen futures. The accumulation of this evidence took a profound toll on Eleanor, a fact she documents with chilling clarity. She writes of sleepless nights, haunted by the names in the book, of seeing the faces of lost children in her dreams. The grief for her husband was now dwarfed by a larger, more monstrous sorrow. She understood now that his suicide was not an act of cowardice, but perhaps the only act of conscience left to a man trapped in an unholy machine, a man who had chosen death over continued complicity. Nadia's role in this process was transformative. She was no longer a silent servant, but a vital partner in the investigation, her memory a living archive of the community's hidden sorrows. She could connect the dates in the ledger to specific disappearances from the plantations, to stories whispered among the enslaved of a child who vanished after being taken to the big house for inspection. Her knowledge gave faces and names to Arthur Whitby's cold, methodical accounting. The final pages of Eleanor's diary for that summer document a growing sense of urgency and danger. She knew she possessed a truth so toxic it could destroy the very foundations of Beaufort society. "This book is a litany of their sins," she wrote. "It explains everything, their wealth, their piety, their absolute power. It is all built on the bones of these children, and they will kill to protect it." The evidence was no longer just an anomaly. It was a weapon, and she was standing in the heart of enemy territory. By the early autumn of 1842, the scattered pieces of the puzzle had coalesced into a single, horrifying image. The first clear articulation of Eleanor Whitby's hypothesis is recorded in a single, devastating diary entry, dated September 3rd. The entry is not a speculative query, but a statement of fact, written with the cold, hard clarity of a truth that, once seen, can never be unseen. It is the moment her investigation culminates in a terrible and complete understanding of the conspiracy that surrounded her. She begins the entry without preamble, her words a direct accusation against the world that had condemned her. "The ledger is not a record of goods," she wrote, her pen strokes deep and forceful on the page. "It is a registry of souls. It is a detailed accounting of the systematic theft and sale of enslaved children, an enterprise operated by the very men who lead this town in prayer on Sundays. Sterling, Davies, Alston, the founding families of Beaufort, they have not been trading in cotton or rice. They have been trading in children." This declaration marked a profound shift in her perception of her late husband. No longer was he simply a failed merchant or a tragic victim. She now understood his precise role in the horrific machine. He had been their bookkeeper, the man whose skill with numbers was used to track the profits from human misery. His suicide was reframed as a final desperate act of sabotage, an attempt to leave behind the evidence he was too afraid to expose while alive. The most personal and agonizing revelation in this entry concerns Nadia. With a terrible, dawning horror, Eleanor describes the moment she and Nadia found a specific name on the third page of the ledger, an entry from 1838. The transaction was for one male unit, approximately 7 years old, noted as being in good condition, sold to a plantation in the Alabama Territory. Next to the entry was the name Cale. Eleanor wrote, "Nadia made no sound, but a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Cale was her brother." This discovery transformed the investigation from a quest for abstract justice into a deeply personal vendetta. The crime was no longer just a stain on the soul of Beaufort. It was a wound in the heart of their own diminished household. Nadia's quiet, persistent grief was now given a name, a date, and a price. The ledger was not just a record of a crime against a people. It was the bill of sale for a piece of Nadia's own soul. In her writing, Eleanor's grief for her husband fully solidifies into a cold, diamond-hard rage. Her sorrow is burned away, replaced by a singular, all-consuming purpose. "Arthur's sin was his silence," she wrote. "My redemption will be my voice. They built their fortunes on the silence of the dead and the powerless. But they did not count on the fury of a widow with nothing left to lose and the memory of a woman who has forgotten nothing." The hypothesis was complete. The time for analysis was over. The time for action had begun. She understood the full scope of the danger she was in. The ledger was not just incriminating, it was a death warrant. The men it implicated were not just criminals, they were the law in Beaufort. They controlled the courts, the church, and the public discourse. Any direct accusation would be dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken, destitute woman. To challenge them openly would be suicide, a fate she was determined to avoid. Her hypothesis also included a chilling addendum about the town's collective guilt. She realized the conspiracy was too large, too systematic, to have been a complete secret. Others must have known, or at least suspected. The town's polite silence was not born of ignorance, but of complicity. The prosperity of Beaufort was inextricably linked to this dark trade, and its citizens were all, in some way, beneficiaries of the crime. The entry concludes with a vow, a quiet promise made to the pages of her diary. "They have made me an outcast," she wrote. "They do not yet understand the power they have given me. I will use their judgment of me as a shield. While they watch the mad widow, I will be dismantling their world, one name at a time, for Arthur, for Cale, and for all the others whose names are written in this book of the dead." The hypothesis was not just a theory, it was a battle plan. The first shot in Eleanor Whitby's silent war was not fired by her, but against her. The social fracture began with a legal notice, a cold, impersonal declaration that codified her ruin. In early October 1842, a notice of public auction was posted in the town square and printed in the Beaufort Gazette. It listed the remaining assets of the late Arthur Whitby's estate, to be sold to satisfy his numerous creditors. The list was meagre: some worn furniture, a carriage in disrepair, but at the very bottom was the entry that would trigger Eleanor's most audacious act. Also to be conveyed, one Creole female named Nadia, aged 19, in sound health. This notice was more than a financial instrument. It was an act of violence. For the town, it was a routine transaction, the logical conclusion of a bankruptcy. For Eleanor, it was an intolerable threat. Selling Nadia meant not only losing her only ally, but also severing the last living link to the truth of the ledger. More than that, it was a moral abomination she could not permit. Her diary entry from that day is a testament to her desperation and her cunning. "They seek to tear this house apart," she wrote. "They think they are settling an account. They are about to discover I have an accounting of my own." Her response was an act of legal and social defiance so profound it sent shockwaves through Beaufort society. As she meticulously details in her diary, she retrieved a blank marriage certificate Arthur had acquired years prior for a business venture that never materialized. With painstaking care, she forged her late husband's signature, backdating the document to the week before his death. In the space for the bride's name, she wrote Nadia, and in the space for her status, she wrote property of the groom. She then filed the document with a traveling circuit magistrate, a man unfamiliar with Beaufort's local politics, claiming the union was a deathbed wish. The legal theory she concocted was a brilliant, if desperate, gambit. She argued that under the English common law of coverture, a wife's legal identity was subsumed by her husband's. Therefore, upon Arthur's death, Nadia had not become part of his estate to be sold, but had passed directly into Eleanor's care as her legal chattel, her wife and her property simultaneously. It was a paradoxical argument that twisted the perverse logic of slavery and patriarchy against itself. The community's reaction was swift and merciless. The forgery itself was shocking, but the nature of the claimed union was an unforgivable offense against racial, religious, and moral order. The editor of the Beaufort Gazette published a scathing editorial, refusing to even name the women, referring only to the unnatural and sacrilegious union that had brought a stain of Sodom upon our God-fearing community. The act was interpreted not as a legal maneuver to protect a servant, but as a confession of profound depravity. The social fracture was now absolute. Friends and neighbors who had offered lukewarm condolences now crossed the street to avoid Eleanor. The vestry of St. Helena Episcopal Church sent her a formal letter of excommunication, declaring her an apostate and barring her from the very grounds of the church. She was no longer just a poor widow, she was a pariah, a contaminant. The scandal of her forbidden marriage became the talk of the town, a story so sensational it completely overshadowed the quiet tragedy of her husband's death. This, Eleanor reveals in her diary, was precisely her intention. The scandal was a smokescreen, a cloud of moral outrage that would distract the town from her true purpose. While Beaufort was busy whispering about her supposed perversions, she was free to move about, her activities now beneath the notice of a society that had already cast her out. Her isolation became her greatest weapon. "They are all looking at the monster they think I am," she wrote. "No one is looking at my hands. No one is watching where I walk." The forged document, while socially damning, had the desired legal effect. The creditors, faced with a bizarre and unprecedented legal claim and unwilling to engage in a protracted and scandalous court battle, temporarily withdrew their claim on Nadia. The auction was postponed. A fragile temporary stalemate was achieved. Eleanor had bought herself time, but at the cost of her place in the world. The social fracture was complete. The doors of Beaufort society slammed shut, locking Eleanor and Nadia inside their decaying home, a small island in a sea of condemnation. But inside those walls, a new and powerful alliance was solidifying. They were no longer mistress and servant, but co-conspirators in a war against the very foundations of the world that had rejected them. The town thought it had contained the threat, but it had only given it a fortress from which to plan the coming attack. Now a social ghost, Eleanor Whitby found herself endowed with a strange and potent form of freedom. The very ostracism meant to punish her had rendered her invisible. No one met her gaze. No one acknowledged her presence on the rare occasions she walked the town's streets. This invisibility became her shield as she embarked on the most dangerous phase of her investigation. Her diary from this period documents a series of clandestine movements, guided by Nadia's intimate knowledge of Beaufort's hidden pathways and secret histories. Nadia knew that the town's most powerful men, the pillars of the church, often conducted their most profane business within its sacred walls. She directed Eleanor to St. Helena Episcopal, the very institution that had cast her out. According to Eleanor's account, they entered the church not through the main doors, but through a small, unlocked service entrance in the rear, moving like shadows through the empty nave in the dead of night. Their destination was the church vestry, the administrative heart of the parish. It was there, guided by a story Nadia had overheard from a sexton years ago, that they found the irrefutable evidence. Beneath a loose floorboard, hidden under a stack of old hymnals, was a second ledger. This one was not bound in fine leather like Arthur's, but was a simple utilitarian account book. If Arthur's ledger was the record of supply, this new book was the record of demand. It contained the buyers' names, the prices paid for each child, and even notes on their specific attributes. The discovery of this second ledger had a profound and transformative impact on Eleanor. Her diary entry describing the moment is chilling in its lack of emotional language. The rage has cooled into something harder, more focused. She writes not of horror, but of cold, calculating certainty. She was no longer just a woman seeking justice for her husband and her companion. She was the self-appointed arbiter of a judgment that had been deferred for too long. The details in the church ledger were far more explicit than Arthur's coded entries. It listed children by their first names, their ages, and their skills. It contained notes like strong for field work or suitable for house service. It was the unvarnished, brutal calculus of the trade, a document that stripped away all pretense of civility. The discovery confirmed that the conspiracy was not just a side business for a few corrupt men. It was an organized enterprise with its own internal bookkeeping, operating from the very moral center of the community. The impact on Eleanor is best summarized by her own words, written by candlelight in her study after returning from the church. "They cast me out as a sinner," she penned, her handwriting steady and clear. "They do not realize they have freed me. An outcast has no reputation to protect. A ghost has no fear of the dark. I now hold their entire world in my hands, written in their own script. I will not merely expose them, I will haunt them all." The meek, grieving widow was gone, replaced by an avenging angel. This second piece of evidence was crucial because it was irrefutable. Arthur's ledger could have been dismissed as the product of a disturbed mind, the delusions of a bankrupt. But the church ledger, with its different handwriting and its corroborating details, was undeniable proof. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the document that tied the suppliers to the buyers, completing the chain of complicity that ran through the heart of Beaufort. With this new evidence in her possession, Eleanor's strategy shifted. Her initial goal had been to understand her husband's death. Now her objective was far grander, the complete and total annihilation of the power structure that had created the system. She was no longer just defending herself, she was on the attack. The knowledge she now possessed was not just a shield, but a sword. The final paragraph of her entry on the discovery of the church ledger is a cold and methodical outline of her next steps. She writes of the need to make copies, to find a way to get the evidence out of Beaufort to an authority untouched by the town's corruption. The moral outrage is now tempered by a clear, strategic vision. The invisible woman had found her weapon, and she was now planning how and where to strike for maximum impact. As autumn deepened, the men who ran Beaufort began to sense a shift in the atmosphere. The scandal of the forbidden marriage had been effective in isolating Eleanor Whitby, but it had not broken her. Her continued, quiet existence seemed to unnerve them. The first documented sign of this collapse of confidence appears in a private letter, a piece of correspondence that reveals the panic growing behind the town's facade of righteous authority. The letter, dated October 1842, was written by Magistrate Thomas Sterling and sent to a physician in Charleston known for his work in the field of mental maladies. The document, which now resides in the archives of the Medical University of South Carolina, is a thinly veiled attempt to neutralize Eleanor. Sterling describes her as being in a state of hysterical bereavement, prone to dark fantasies and slanderous accusations born of her grief and social humiliation. He formally requests that the physician travel to Beaufort to conduct an inquiry into her sanity with the explicit goal of having her committed to the state asylum. The letter is a classic weapon of the patriarchy, an attempt to silence a threatening woman by declaring her mad. This letter is a clear record of the magistrate's fear. He does not mention the ledgers, of course, but his desperation to have Eleanor institutionalized suggests he suspected she knew more than she was letting on. Her quiet defiance was more terrifying to him than any loud accusation would have been. He needed to remove her from the board entirely, to lock her away where her words would be dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. This was not the act of a confident authority figure, but of a guilty man trying to bury a witness. Eleanor, it seems, was fully aware of his intentions. A diary entry from the same week shows an almost preternatural understanding of her enemy's mind. She writes, "Sterling seeks to silence me by declaring me mad. He sends for doctors from Charleston. He is right to be afraid. But he thinks the battle is here, in Beaufort, a matter of his word against mine." Her tone is not one of fear, but of scorn. She saw his move not as a threat, but as a foolish miscalculation. Her entry continues with a chilling declaration of her strategic advantage. "He cannot see that my judgment will not come from this corrupted place," she wrote. "It will not be decided in his courtroom or by his doctors. It will descend upon him from an authority he cannot bribe or intimidate." This marks the moment she solidifies her decision to seek federal intervention, to take her evidence to a power that lay beyond the reach of Beaufort's insular and corrupt network of influence. The magistrate's attempt to have her committed was a profound tactical error. In trying to preemptively discredit her, he confirmed her own assessment of the situation, that the local systems of power were designed not to find truth, but to protect the guilty. He had shown his hand, revealing that his authority was a fragile construct, vulnerable to any truth it could not control. The recorded collapse of his nerve was a sign that the entire edifice was beginning to crumble from within. The Charleston physician, as records show, did travel to Beaufort. However, he was met at the Whitby house by a woman of such calm, articulate intelligence that he could find no grounds for commitment. His report back to Stirling, a copy of which was found among the magistrate's papers after his arrest, states that Mrs. Whitby was eccentric and grieving, but possessed of all her faculties. The attempt to use medicine as a weapon had failed. This failure seemed to accelerate the decay of the magistrate's authority. Whispers began to circulate. Why was Stirling so obsessed with the poor widow Whitby? What was he so afraid of? His panicked actions had inadvertently drawn attention back to a matter the town had been eager to forget. The cracks in the wall of silence were beginning to show, and it was his own fear that was widening them. Eleanor's diary notes this shift with grim satisfaction. "His fear is a bell," she wrote. "He rings it for all to hear, and soon they will begin to wonder what he is so afraid of. He thinks he is building my cage, but he is digging his own grave." The collapse of authority was not yet public, but in the private correspondence and failed schemes of the town's most powerful man, the end was already being written. Just as Eleanor's plan began to crystallize into a cold legal strategy, a new discovery shifted its moral and spiritual center. The source was not a document of ink and paper, but one of earth and memory. An entry in her diary from early November describes Nadia leading her from the house at twilight, not towards the town, but away from it, deep into the sprawling, labyrinthine salt marsh that bordered the property. Their journey was silent, guided by Nadia's innate knowledge of the land. Eleanor's writing paints a vivid, atmospheric picture of the marsh. She describes the air thick with the smell of salt and decay, the cypress knees rising from the brackish water like skeletal fingers, and the sky bleeding purple and orange at the horizon. It was a liminal space, neither fully land nor fully sea, a place outside the rigid boundaries of Beaufort society. It was here, in this wild, untamed world, that Nadia would reveal the story's most sacred and hidden source. They arrived at a small hummock of land, a slight rise in the marsh, barely distinguishable from its surroundings, yet clearly a place of significance. The ground was marked not with carved headstones, but with arrangements of seashells, pieces of worn glass, and simple hand-carved wooden totems. Eleanor's diary records her slow, dawning realization. This was a burial ground, an unmarked and secret cemetery known only to the enslaved community. Nadia, her voice low and reverent, explained the meaning of the place. This was where they remembered the ones the masters had erased. It was the final resting place for those who died on the plantations without a Christian burial, for stillborn infants, and for the spirits of those sold away, whose bodies would never return. But most importantly, Nadia pointed to a series of small, shallow depressions in the earth, marked only by a single smooth stone. This, she said, was where they remembered the lost children. Eleanor's description of this moment is the emotional heart of her entire journal. She writes, "There were no names, only the silence of the earth. Nadia told me this is where they remember the children the masters erased from their books and their lives. This is where their souls are kept safe. Here they are not forgotten. Here we would find our justice." See, the ledger was the evidence of the crime, but this hidden grove was the testament to its human cost. This discovery profoundly altered Eleanor's understanding of her mission. It was no longer simply about exposing a crime and punishing the guilty. It had become a sacred duty to honor the dead, to give voice to the silenced. The legal and financial evidence was essential, but it was hollow without the spiritual weight of this place. The unmarked graves were the true source of her authority, a moral mandate that transcended any earthly court. The visit to the burial ground also cemented the bond between Eleanor and Nadia, dissolving the last vestiges of their former roles. In that sacred space, they were not white and black, not mistress and servant, but two women bound by a shared purpose, united in their grief and their resolve. Eleanor writes that as they stood there, Nadia placed a hand on her arm, a simple gesture that conveyed a universe of shared understanding. The fight was no longer just Eleanor's, it was theirs. The hidden source provided the missing piece of their plan. The ledgers would provide the legal basis for the attack, but the memory of this place would provide its soul. Eleanor understood that true justice was not just about confiscating fortunes and imprisoning powerful men. It was about remembrance, about ensuring that the stories of the lost children were not just recorded, but honored. As they walked back from the marsh under a sky full of stars, Eleanor's diary records a profound sense of peace and clarity. The path forward was now clear. She was armed not only with irrefutable proof of a crime, but with the spiritual authority of its victims. The hidden burial ground in the salt marsh had transformed her quest for revenge into a holy war. The final battle would be fought not just for the living, but for the dead. The discovery in the salt marsh galvanized Eleanor Whitby, transforming her strategic planning into a series of swift, decisive actions. Her diary entries for the latter half of November 1842 lose their introspective quality, becoming instead a cold, procedural record of her preparations for the final gambit. Each entry is a meticulously detailed step in a plan designed for maximum impact and a clean escape. The time for gathering evidence was over. The time for deploying it had arrived. The first step was the painstaking process of duplicating the evidence. Eleanor describes nights spent with Nadia, the two of them working by a single candle, transcribing the damning pages of both ledgers onto fresh paper. It was a slow, arduous task, fraught with the risk of discovery. She notes Nadia's remarkable memory, her ability to recall names and dates that had been partially obscured by water damage or faded ink. They were not just copying a document, they were reconstructing a history of pain. Once the copies were complete, Eleanor detailed her method for securing them. She sewed the transcribed pages into the lining of a heavy traveling cloak, distributing them so they would not create a suspicious bulge. The original ledgers, she decided, were too dangerous to transport. They would be her final parting gift to the town of Beaufort. Her diary specifies the location where she would hide them, a place where they would eventually be found, ensuring the town could never fully deny what had happened. Simultaneously, she began to make arrangements for their escape. She used what little money she had left to secure passage for two women on a northbound merchant schooner, the North Star, scheduled to depart from Charleston in early December. She booked the passage through a third party, a freedman who occasionally did work for her, using the aliases Mrs. Gray and Companion. The transaction was recorded in her diary with the detached precision of a general planning a troop movement. The most critical step was establishing contact with an external authority. Arthur, in his final paranoid weeks, had once mentioned a name in fear: Elias Thorne, a Charleston-based lawyer known for his quiet but fervent abolitionist sympathies. He was a man who operated on the fringes of polite society, a legal scholar who used his knowledge of the law to subvert the very system he was part of. Eleanor penned a coded letter to Thorne, referencing a mutual acquaintance, a fictional London merchant, and requesting a meeting on a matter of sensitive accounts. Her justification for this entire elaborate plan is laid out in a single powerful entry. She reflects on the nature of Beaufort, seeing it not as a community that could be healed, but as a fundamentally corrupt organism. "This town is a tomb," she wrote, "built on the bones of children. One cannot reform a tomb. One can only seal it. My purpose is not to save Beaufort from its sins, but to ensure its sins are brought into the light, so that the structure itself collapses under the weight of its own wickedness." The suspense in these entries builds not through action, but through the cold, methodical detailing of her preparations. She describes packing a single small bag for herself and Nadia, containing only a change of clothes, the sewn cloak, and her diary. She was systematically erasing herself from the house, preparing to leave behind the life of Eleanor Whitby forever. There is no sentimentality in her writing, only a relentless forward momentum. Nadia's role in these final days was paramount. She was the one who gathered information from the town, who knew the patrol schedules of the night watch, who secured the transport that would take them from Beaufort to the Charleston docks under the cover of darkness. Eleanor's diary credits Nadia with being the architect of their physical escape, while she herself was the architect of the town's destruction. They were a perfectly synchronized team, each with her own vital part to play. The final entry before they enact their plan is a quiet, reflective moment. Eleanor writes not of the danger or the uncertainty of the future, but of the moral clarity she has found. "For months, I have lived as a ghost in this house," she penned. "Tomorrow, we give that ghost a purpose. We will vanish from this place, but we will leave behind a reckoning that will never be forgotten." The decision was made. The action was planned. The judgment of Beaufort was about to begin. The last chapter of Eleanor Whitby's life in Beaufort is recorded in two final, disparate sources. The first is the last known entry in her personal diary, a document that serves as the spiritual and emotional climax of her story. It is dated December 1st, 1842, the night before she and Nadia would disappear forever. The entry is brief, suffused with a sense of ritual closure and profound, solemn purpose. It describes one final journey into the darkness. "Tonight," she wrote, her script serene and steady, "we went back to the marsh. The air was cold and clean. We carried with us a small bundle of rosemary, gathered from the one patch that still grows by the back wall. We planted a sprig on each of the unmarked graves. One for each name in the ledger, for remembrance. Tomorrow the package is sent to Mr. Thorne. Our part in this is done. May God not have mercy on their souls, for they had none for the children." This act was their true farewell, a spiritual settling of accounts that transcended any legal justice. This final entry is not a plea for victory, but a benediction for the dead. The planting of rosemary, the herb of remembrance, was a deeply symbolic act. It was a promise that even as she and Nadia vanished, the memory of the lost children would remain, taking root in the very soil of the place that had tried to erase them. It was the final, quiet ritual of their private war, a moment of grace before the storm they were about to unleash. The second primary source is of a completely different nature. It is a mundane, official document, the shipping manifest of the schooner North Star, which departed from the port of Charleston on December 3, 1842. The document, now held in the Maritime Archives, lists its cargo of cotton and indigo and its small number of passengers. Among them, an entry lists 2 females, destination Philadelphia, Mrs. Gray and companion. This is the last recorded trace of Eleanor Whitby and Nadia in the South. Interpreted together, these 2 documents tell the full story of their departure. The diary entry is the record of their spiritual exodus, the moment they release themselves from the haunting of Beaufort by creating a permanent, living memorial for its victims. The shipping manifest is the record of their physical escape, the cold, hard proof of their success in vanishing from a world that sought to either condemn or consume them. They had become the ghosts Eleanor had so often written about, slipping away unnoticed. The identity of Mrs. Gray is a final, poignant detail. It was a name without history, without connection to the scandal-plagued Whitby name. It was the first step in creating a new life, a new identity in a world where they would be judged not by their pasts, but by their present. The ambiguity of "and companion" is equally powerful, a descriptor that erases the brutal categories of mistress and slave, leaving only the simple, undeniable fact of their togetherness. The silence that follows these two documents is as profound as any written record. There are no further diary entries, no letters, no official sightings. They stepped off the page of Southern history and into the realm of speculation and legend. Their disappearance was as quiet and complete as the justice that would soon descend upon Beaufort in their absence. They had delivered their evidence and then vanished, leaving the consequences to unfold without them. The interpretation of this final act is clear. Their victory was not in seeing their enemies punished, but in achieving their own freedom and ensuring the dead were remembered. They did not need to witness the collapse of Sterling's world. It was enough to know that they had set it in motion. Their final sources are not about an ending, but about a transition, from a story of revenge to a story of liberation. The cold, official script of the shipping manifest and the warm, living ritual described in the diary are the two halves of their final statement. One speaks of a journey over water, the other of a commitment to the earth. Together they represent the complete and total rejection of Beaufort's world and the creation of their own, a world where justice is measured in remembrance and freedom is found in anonymity. The reckoning that Eleanor Whitby set in motion arrived in Beaufort not with a whisper, but with the force of a tidal wave. The documented consequences of her actions are found not in the local paper, but in the archives of federal authority, a power far beyond the reach of Magistrate Sterling's influence. In February of 1843, clippings from the Charleston Courier report on a stunning and unprecedented event, the arrival of United States Marshals in the town of Beaufort. The newspaper articles, written with a tone of shocked disbelief, described the swift and decisive arrests of Magistrate Thomas Sterling, as well as planters Alston and Davies. The charges were federal offenses: fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the 1808 Act prohibiting importation of slaves, which was interpreted to cover the illegal interstate trafficking of enslaved persons. The evidence, the article notes, was provided by an anonymous source and was said to be irrefutable and voluminous. The entire power structure of Beaufort was decapitated in a single surgical strike. Records from the U.S. District Court of South Carolina confirm the outcome. Faced with copies of their own meticulous ledgers, the men offered no defense. Their properties, their fortunes, their legacies, all built on the stolen lives of children, were confiscated by the federal government. They died in a federal prison in Virginia, far from the town they had once ruled as kings. The justice Eleanor had sought from outside had been delivered, and it was absolute. The most telling record of the aftermath, however, is found in what is missing. A thorough review of the Beaufort Gazette from that entire year reveals no mention of the arrests, the trial, or the confiscations. The town's official voice remained stubbornly, defiantly silent. It reported on crop prices, local weddings and parish bake sales, creating a written record of a reality that no longer existed. The shame was so profound that the town chose to collectively erase the event from its own history, pretending it had never happened. The legacy of Eleanor and Nadia, therefore, became one of folklore and whispers. With no official account to explain the sudden downfall of its most powerful men, the community filled the vacuum with legend. A letter from a Beaufort resident to her sister in Savannah, dated 1845, is the first written account of this new mythology. It speaks of the terrible Whitby business and the belief that Eleanor, in her depravity, had laid a curse upon the town before she vanished, a hex that brought ruin to any family built on stolen souls. This legend of the widow's curse persisted for generations. It became a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to frighten children, its true origins obscured by time and deliberate forgetting. The story of two women who engineered a legal and moral coup was transformed into a supernatural tale, a far more palatable narrative than the truth of a community's deep-seated complicity in an unimaginable crime. The town could live with a curse. It could not live with its own reflection. The physical legacy of their actions also endured. The confiscated lands were eventually broken up and sold, but they were said to be blighted, plagued by crop failures and misfortune. The grand mansions fell into disrepair. The curse, it seemed, had taken root in the very soil. The town of Beaufort recovered financially, but its golden age was over. The moral rot that Eleanor had exposed had left a permanent scar on its psyche. The names of Eleanor Whitby and Nadia were never spoken again in any official capacity in Beaufort. They became ghosts, their true story buried beneath layers of shame, silence, and folklore. Their disappearance was so complete that they were effectively erased. But their legacy was not in their names. It was in the empty houses of the powerful, in the federal court records that still bear witness to their crimes, and in the persistent whispered story of a widow's righteous anger. The final documented consequence is a quiet one. Census records from the 1850s show a statistically significant drop in the number of child disappearances reported from the parishes around Beaufort. The machine had been broken, the trade had been stopped, the silent, bloody work of the ledgers had ceased. This, more than any fortune confiscated or man imprisoned, was the true measure of their victory. They had not just sought revenge, they had saved lives. The story of Eleanor Whitby and Nadia exists in the spaces between the lines of official history. It is a narrative constructed from fragments, a waterlogged ledger, a private diary, a shipping manifest, and the deliberate, deafening silence of a town's public record. It is a case study in the power of the written word, both to perpetrate and to expose an atrocity. The ledgers of Arthur Whitby and the Beaufort elite were instruments of a crime, while the diary of Eleanor Whitby became the instrument of its judgment. The historical analysis of this case reveals the profound fragility of a social order built on a foundation of lies. Beaufort's antebellum society, with its rigid hierarchies of race, class, and gender, appeared unassailable. Yet it was dismantled by two women who occupied its lowest rungs, a destitute widow and an enslaved woman. Their power came from their invisibility, from their ability to move through the cracks of a system that had already written them off. They turned their marginalization into a weapon. The town's response, total collective amnesia, is as significant as the crime itself. The decision to erase the event from the Beaufort Gazette was a conscious act of historical curation, an attempt to control the narrative by creating a record defined by its omissions. This reveals a fundamental truth, that the most powerful lies are not told in what is said, but in what is never mentioned at all. The silence of Beaufort speaks volumes, a testament to a guilt so deep it could not be faced. The story's resonance carries into the modern era. In 2003, a cultural resource survey was conducted in the salt marshes around Beaufort in preparation for a new golf course development. The archaeological report from that survey documents the discovery of an unmarked burial site on a small hummock containing the skeletal remains of several children, consistent with 19th century burial practices. The discovery made local news for a week before being quietly forgotten, the development plans rerouted. But perhaps the most unsettling piece of the legacy is a botanical one. It exists today, a living, silent testament to the story. A final document, a report from a Clemson University botanist in the early 2000s, notes a peculiar and unexplained anomaly on the grounds of several of Beaufort's most historic estates, all of which once belonged to the families named in Eleanor's evidence. There exist inexplicable, thriving patches of wild rosemary, Rosmarinus officinalis. The botanist notes that the plant is not native to the South Carolina salt marsh environment and that its persistent, localized growth in these specific locations defies ecological explanation. It grows where it should not grow, thriving in soil that should not sustain it. It is a quiet, fragrant, and persistent anomaly, a living echo of a promise made in a diary over 180 years ago, a promise of remembrance. This leaves us with an open and haunting question. What truly takes root in poisoned soil? Is it only the memory of a crime, a curse that blights the land, or can an act of defiant remembrance, a single sprig of rosemary planted on a forgotten grave, become a force of nature itself, a memory that refuses to die, pushing its way through the earth and into the light year after year, forever? The silence of Beaufort holds the answer. The town erased the names of Eleanor and Nadia, but it cannot explain the scent of rosemary that hangs in the air on a summer evening. It cannot explain the feeling of being watched from the windows of its grand, empty houses. And it cannot silence the story that is still told by the land itself, a story of a dark crime, a buried truth, and the two women who brought an empire to justice, leaving behind nothing but a legend and the enduring fragrance of remembrance. The evidence suggests that some stories can never be truly buried. They become part of the landscape, part of the air. The final historical analysis is that the past is not a foreign country. It is the ground beneath our feet. And sometimes it blooms with the memories of those who refuse to be forgotten. Mine is the stories that are most violently erased are often the ones we need to hear the most. They remind us that history is not a settled document, but a battlefield of memory, and that the fight for truth is never truly over. If you believe in the power of unburying these truths, of giving voice to the silenced, then you belong here with us. Subscribe to Before the Story and become part of a community that understands that the most important histories are the ones that lie just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to start digging. We'll see you in the archives.